Thanks everyone for joining us for what I'm sure is going to be a really excellent webinar. Big thanks to Sunrise Labs for collaborating and putting this together. This is an incredible topic that I think is even more relevant in light of COVID-19 and the opportunities that are going to come out of this, right? It's a really tough situation, but there's going to be a lot of opportunities for innovation. And I think keeping your eyes focused on the things that you can be doing to take advantage of current restrictions being eased, funding opportunities, reimbursement pathways opening up for things that have been a little bit more challenging in the past, I think is going to put you in the best position to succeed. So thank you all for joining us. We are thrilled to have you. I'm Rachel Robinson, Vice President of MassMEDIC, and I would love to take this time to introduce Adam Jacobs, who's the CTO of Sunrise Labs, and Alex Therrien he's the Director of User-Centered Design, who will be leading us in this discussion. Just a few little notes. Keep yourself on mute to avoid background noise if possible. If you have questions, you can use the raise your hand button and we'll get to them in real time, or pop them into the chat bot, and Brian and I will kind of run Q&A in the appropriate moment. So please pepper with questions. I think everyone would love to make this as collaborative as possible. So Adam, Alex, I will let you take it away.
Thank you. Great. Welcome, everybody. Thank you so much for joining. It's been it's been a lot of fun putting this together for everybody, and so relevant to our times. We do a lot of connected devices, so it seems appropriate that we're able to present this. And thanks also to Brian, who's part of the MassMEDIC, and all the great work that MassMEDIC does. Just by way of introductions, a little detail. I've been at Sunrise about 8 years. I'm the Chief Technology Officer, and my role really is ensuring project success. And that means integrating all the technology, the business, and the medicine, making sure that all works for you and everybody that's involved in both the products and users of the product. So it's a broad perspective that I'm able to share about medical device development. I've been an exec about 25 years. I have a pretty wide experience. I've been in 3 startups that had successful exits. I've been in 2 mid-sized medical device companies and 2 service companies. So it gives me I've been lucky in my career, and I'm just overwhelmed about my luck at being at Sunrise. So, and Alex, why don't you describe your background?
Yep, thank you. I'm Alex Therrien. I'm the Director of User-Centered Design, and what that translates into is I help to make sure the products that we're working on with our clients really fit to the end user. So my background as an industrial designer, a UX UI designer, and a human factors engineer, I'm bringing that to bear at Sunrise to help coordinate a total user experience for medical devices. My original degree was in industrial design. I've been working in product development and medical devices for about 20 years. And I came to Sunrise about a year ago after having worked with a lot of the people there at a number of other companies previously. I've split my time between 60-40 between consulting and in-house at device manufacturers. And I'm excited here to share my background in bringing medical devices into the home and a recent specialization into connected health and connected drug delivery. So we'll go from there.
And by way of introduction to Sunrise and why we think we have some value and things to share, Sunrise is a medical device development company. It's in Bedford, New Hampshire. It's about an hour north of Boston. We're about 100 people, and we typically run about 20 projects at any given time. We tend to do complicated systems, a lot of software and electronics, but we're a full service organization. We have mechanical engineering, systems engineering, optical engineering, user-centered design. And so we're really fortunate because, we're able to see this wide variety of both opportunities of people that we talk to, but also work on projects, maybe 20 at a time is a lot. So we see things that work and things that don't work. And being able to share some of that with everybody, we think is really great, and have this forum to be able to try to help people be on target, which is we consider our job. And especially in these times when everybody is really talking about home device, I've gotten a number of calls from physicians and companies about going into the home, because that's where people are now. So, and there's a lot of opportunity both with, government support about that. So again, Sunrise is a great place to work, and I just feel glad that we can share some of that with you. Today we're gonna focus on 4 areas. The first is really just general considerations about when you're thinking about doing a home medical device, and that's just sharing some of our thoughts on really in a broad way, bigger than just the device. There's considerations there. Alex will speak about being user-centered in your development approach, and how human factors engineering should go to achieve success. And then we'll go a little bit into some architectures for connectivity in home medical devices, because very often we do a lot of connectivity work. It's been a growth field for us for quite a number of years, and it seems like everybody wants to be connected for one reason or another. And we'll talk about some of the balancing about that, but what that looks like. What are the different pieces? What are the choices you have to make? And we'll try to just share some thoughts on that as well. So when I thought about what we should talk about, the thing that came to mind really was that there's a balance about when you're bringing medical devices into the home. There's lots of different users and requirements, and you have a business model you want to implement, and medical devices have to meet those needs. You have technology requirements, and you have user needs, and there needs to be a balance between those to ensure that you're successful during the adoption of your program. You could be chasing the right problem, but you might have the wrong solution because of you've got that balance wrong. So and as we know, we want to design it right as soon as you can, because when you're doing rework later down the road, it ends up being more expensive. So we'll try to share some wisdom about things to try to balance. One of the things that we often advocate, whether it's home or not, is that we really want to reduce development project risk, and especially when you're getting into a field that's new to you. We really advocate the idea of a minimal viable product, which is the absolute minimum thing that you can do to get into the market, and then you can expand from there. And we'll talk about methodologies to do that. And then of course, there's balancing between the quality, the cost, and the schedule, and how to make making those choices correctly really helps you get successful in your project. And medical devices and acceptance and success in the field is a difficult thing. There's very many stakeholders that often are at odds with each other. You have clinicians that have needs. You have FDA, you have device companies, the manufacturers, payers, hospitals, and now we're throwing into the mix this home user where there's no clinician involved. They're not going to a lab where they're just going to sit there and get blood taken. That they have to be an active participant. They have to get up and do it. And so it's yet another complication in what's already a complicated space. And I will say that I personally love complicated spaces. I'm drawn to them, and I've always taken on hard projects and problems. So that's I think maybe the reason I ended up in medical devices. So getting that balance is really what we're going to talk about a little bit. You all, most of you probably know, really starting out with the market and user requirement documents, the first step that we typically start with. And one of the reason I'm bringing it up is because when you're getting into a home device, you really want to simplify things. And so you're going to need to define your minimum viable product, but you also need to design your future enhancements and your requirements for the future, because what you're going to do is you're going to design the system for expandability. So you design it so that you can get to market quickly, but still support the growth that you need. And again, that's not unique to home devices, but it's accented because it's just extra hurdles that you have to overcome. So and this is just me on my soapbox, I really think that you have to be ruthless when you're, doing a minimum viable product. There's a lot of different people who think things are important. Someone has to be the arbiter of this, and it's hard to resist the temptation to expand the minimum viable product. So, a big question in a home medical product is connectivity necessary? Everybody seems to want to be connected these days. We have a lot of people coming with things that don't necessarily seem like they need connectivity to operate, but they want it for various reasons for their own, which we'll talk about some of those reasons. So who does it help? Does it help the patient? Does it help the business? Is this really necessary? An example would be, quite often people come to us with some novel, either diagnostic platform or diagnostic test. Maybe it's a biotech marker for some blood disease or some new blood test. And they're doing something really novel. Maybe there's a new diagnostic platform with nanotubes or God knows what, and they have really a lot to do just to make the core technology work. So should really connectivity be included in that first release? There might be good reasons to do it, and but it might be just a complication that is one more risk item in the project, and so you have to decide which features are really necessary to get there, and then what data is really needed to collect to perform the minimum function, but then what might you want to be able to expand into? So it's an especially important thing in a home product, because people just assume that, well, everyone's got a cell phone, so everyone's going to want to connect and everyone's going to want to do this, and it's Alex will talk more about that. So we mentioned architecting the MVP for expandability. So what are things that really you do want to include? One thing we see, for example, in user interfaces is that there'll be a happy path of motion. That's mostly what people think about. They think, well, everything's going to go great. The users are going to do the right thing, and the machine's going to work great, and temperature is going to be right, and the diagnostic disposable is going to work and seat just perfectly. But we all know that that's not what happens. So we call it the not happy path, and we end up spending a lot of time on that because it's not often what people are focused on, and you really do need to include the not happy paths early on thinking about that, and that's one of the things that a human factors group will do. They'll find those and find out what works, but also the system engineers do that. So typically, in an MVP, what you might do is you might have some of those, and then you just might include hooks for some not so happy paths. There might be some things where people have said, we'll live with, well, it didn't work for now, and then we'll later we'll have features for service and manufacturability, and we'll do all that later. So that's basically the MVP talk. The other thing that's important is that, getting back to the idea of stakeholder balance, it's hard to overestimate how important this is. If you're a patient at home and you there's things that you want. You're using this device because you want something, you want some value, some medical value. You want to know what your blood pressure is. You want to make sure your insulin levels are within range, whatever the home device is. And you pretty much want it to be easy and fast. People do not like, difficult things. The famous, maybe I'm telling my age here, but the VCR programming that nobody could ever do, or even, wristwatches, right? People just won't do it if it's difficult to do. And typically people want privacy. I mean, people don't want necessarily a lot of medical data being, or just data being shared. What does the physician want? What I see over and over again is they want actionable information. If you see what they get from lab results and things like that, it's things that they can action. They don't want information for the sake of information. And they want improved outcomes. And often what we see is that just because you're in the home and you're generating this huge flood of data, maybe you're measuring somebody's blood pressure or heart rate, you have them on a Holter monitor. They don't want to see 3 weeks of heartbeats. They want to see some actionable information. And so the company, what does the company want? The company is trying to build a business. They're trying to build an infrastructure for that business. They might have a business model where they're controlling payments. There's pay per use, or disallowing usage for various reasons, like if there's a counterfeit disposable or connection. So they often want data if they're doing some machine learning algorithms. They might want data for their own development. And one of the older ones is the ability to service and diagnose. So these are very different perspectives on what this home device is gonna do, and there's really not much overlap there. So and I mean, everybody says, and everybody really does want patient improved outcomes. So I'll give that to everybody, because I think we're all in this for the right reasons. So what are some examples of this? The user may not want to share medical or personal use information. Maybe it's a woman's health or pregnancy test, and a woman doesn't want people to know if she's pregnant, or there's DNA testing that there's more and more PCA going on that's right in the home. People might not want some of that stuff shared, whereas the medical device company might want this abundant information for machine learning, for example, or billing or tracking the device. And those really can be really at odds with each other. The patient might want to control their own usage, whereas clinicians want compliance. Now, those are really in direct conflict. So, patients, as we know, patient compliance, and there's an idea that people will improve patient compliance, but patients don't always want or act that way. The user might just not want to bother. They're like, well, why do I want to do this? It's time and effort, and whereas the hospital, is incentivized to reduce readmission costs, for example, and so they get penalized for readmission, so they might want to send a device home, but now you're asking somebody to do something, and they're like, well, why do I want to bother with that? It's a different need. And finally, there might be extra steps that I was always a believer that less is more when it comes to making something easy to use, but you might be introducing safety related usabilities, because an extra step might actually make your effectiveness or safety higher. Your diagnostic test might be more accurate if you keep it in the refrigerator, but that's but you may introduce safety related usability errors by doing that. So those are just kind of some general considerations and things that we've seen over and over again, and kind of a way to frame the problem of balancing the perspectives that you're going to need to think about. You're not dealing with clinicians anymore. You're not dealing with people who are highly trained, or people who even are going to do what you ask them to do. So bottom line is that if the stakeholder balance is off, you can really negatively affect your market acceptance. If you have a blood pressure monitor, like we talked about within the hospital admissions, about the hospital wants to know about, and the person says, well, I've always had high blood pressure, I'm not going to bother. So, and finally, the last thing is back to the MVP a little bit. There is this overreach that we see over and over again. That you can have, if you overreach, sometimes you can have less user acceptance because there's more to do. You can have higher project costs and longer schedules, and also a big one is unnecessary regulatory burdens. One of the things about home usage is that that depending on your FDA claims, it really can change the summative testing, the usability, the human factor summative testing that you have to do, and that Alex can talk about later. It also changed some of you might be familiar with software safety classes for software development and medical devices. Your claims can really make your regulatory burden go up and costs go up, and we've seen this over and over again. Trying to keep those claims balanced with your regulatory burden is a very important thing, especially in the home arena, where you have there's clear waivers and there's lots and lots of user groups that can get pulled into a summative test. So those are kind of my thoughts on the as just an introduction. And the bottom line is, balance your stakeholder needs and get the requirements to reflect the right product. So those are two thoughts that are I've been just trying to bring to the.
Thanks, Adam. Adam, this is Brian Johnson. I'm going to give you a second just to get maybe a sip of water. Thanks for that. It's a great table setter. Well, I wanted to ask both of you a quick question, a couple questions here, just to kind of frame the moment. So clearly right now, this is a tremendous use case proof for telemedicine, right? But as innovators, how do we look at capitalizing on the moment without sort of over adjusting to what may be a temporary reality? So it seems to me like, here we are, we're all more in need of connecting to healthcare than ever. But we're homebound. How do we weigh what we see as tremendous opportunities maybe in the now versus in the future, especially in regards to sort of home, med tech in the home? I was wondering how should we think about this as innovators at this moment? Is this a data collection moment, or is this a just get in the garage and start building stuff?
Well, I'll say that we've gotten a lot of interaction with people who are asking sort of the same question. How do we, what's the proper way to do this, and is it doable because the time frame is shorter than the normal development paths for medical devices. And there are some things that we've done along those lines. We've shortened timelines in a number of ways, and so have the regulators shortened timelines to accommodate the whole pandemic that's going on now. So, for example, this idea of a minimum viable product comes right into this. It's one of the reasons I brought it up because, for example, we've been talking to people. And some of the things that we recommend are taking what you have and just doing really the minimum things you need to do to get it out quickly. So somebody's in maybe a prototype phase of their product development. Don't do that extra spin of the PC board if it works. Get it out there faster, and then in parallel we'll do that spin of the PC board for the longer term. And features, let's put all those features off, but you can get your basic functionality going. And it really does come back. The MVP is certainly part of it, but regulatorily, the FDA is making accommodations for allowing medical device companies to essentially, it's like self-certifying. If you guys remember CE mark, you could self-certify, and then you're going to come back. And so if you've followed your process and there's been an accommodation for this. I haven't known anybody to do it yet, but there's been a lot of planning going on around it. So those are two things that are interesting along those lines.
Yeah, it's also interesting, and then I'll just let you interject. I just want to say something real quick. It reminds me of a 2012 Masimo put out an iPhone version of the pulse oximeter, and I remember they sent it to me, and for the life of me, I thought, oh, this is kind of neat, and then I played with it for 5 minutes, and I'll tell you, now 8 years later, I was digging into my junk drawer trying to find that thing like crazy. It took 8 years for that product to have probably its perfect moment. So that's kind of an aside. And I know there was another comment.
Thanks, Brian. And it's a really great question because I don't think at the end of this crisis, things are going to go back to the way they were before, to be honest. I had a tick bite that did a little ring around it, and I call my doctor, I take a picture of it, I send it to them. They call prescription into the drugstore, I go get it, instead of my having to go into an office with a bunch of other sick people and maybe catch other things on the way. So I think a lot of the things we're discovering during this crisis are going to turn out to be the new normal in a good way.
Great.
And, I can speak to some part of this here, and I'm actually going to take over and pivot off of this. Adam, if you don't mind turning over control. As we talk about this, there's sort of this macro trend that you're talking about here, which is moving into the home. That's been going on for some time. As we get acceleration out of this, it's interesting. If we want to deliver healthcare at home, what are we going to do next? I don't think the opportunity is going to go away. It's more about the implementation. every project that I'm sure anybody's ever worked on has always felt some level of time pressure. The opportunities that are in front of us certainly can add to that. We want to move into the home. We want to deliver healthcare. We want to make good use of this opportunity where funding is available and regulatory oversight is working in partnership with industry to get products out there that can help. It's really attractive to just jump in and start building and developing things. A counter argument, though, to that is that you might be chasing the right problem with the wrong solution. And so investing time both in prototyping, but also in making sure you understand the problem space, your users, the use environment in a very mature way, helps us to make sure that we're defining the right thing before we're designing it the right way in design controls. And that saves us a lot of money. And as Adam talked about earlier, it ensures that your product is balancing the stakeholders. And we're setting ourselves up for success because we all know that we're avoiding that costly rework at the end of development. If we're moving into the home environment from typical clinical environments, we don't know what we don't know. Users and we may know the disease condition, we may know the health condition, we may understand the technology, but we're changing the use environment. We're going into the home, and it's a much broader environment than the clinical space. You're also working with a much broader population of users. Your previous users had medical training and advanced degrees, and they were more consistent in terms of their demographics. The flexibility in design at this point, as you're going into the home, can be really key here. Our previous users didn't include people who had 6th grade reading comprehension levels, but you also still have people who have advanced degrees. They're not the same people, so how do you address all of them with a single product? Your previous clinician users had capabilities that weren't impacted by their health. So as they're using the device, they're not being degraded in their performance as a user. They're also, in the home environment, likely to evolve over time. They're going to gain experience as they go, and they're going to gain mastery over how to treat their health condition. Their patience level and their expectations of your product to evolve with them. That kind of flexibility in allowing them to move through your user interface successfully and anticipate those growth points, as Adam was discussing earlier in your MVP, that's going to make sure that your product is going to be successful in the long term. Also, our new users are likely to find very different interpretations for what your GUI is telling them. They'll also look at your device as infallible in a lot of ways. They have competing priorities for their attention and time. And understanding what home looks like is really critical to understanding the right approach for solving users' problems. They're going to be taking this device potentially with them into their workplace. They're going to be taking that device with them into their bedroom. Those places are very different, and they probably look different than what I have in my house and what you have in your house. I remember a decade ago, I was first doing risk analysis for human factors work on a peritoneal dialysis device that was in the home, and we had to think about things that I'd never considered before. Feline damage and infectious risk due to pet interacting with a dialysis performer. It's not hypothetical, and it was one of the weirdest things I've had in my career to date, that we were actively considering that and having to design against it. And we have to acknowledge that we're not our users. We don't think like they do. People aren't, as we think about the health conditions, it's really easy to kind of look broadly and say, for example, diabetes. Type 1 patients versus type 2 patients, they have very different life experiences. Individuals with type 1 tend to discover early the condition, and they grow up with it, and it impacts their life over a long period of time. Patients with type 2 diabetes, they tend to have an impact moment, which is very disruptive in a very different way, and they have a harder time adapting to this new lifestyle. Those are easier ones to identify. Some of the tougher ones that aren't always talked about are economic diversity. How their lifestyle is very different than ours, and our own personal experiences. I've never worked in a call center. If I was having to manage my healthcare condition while having very regimented breaks with very limited windows of time where I can take care of myself and go discreetly to a bathroom to take an injection, That's a very different lifestyle than what I'm afforded, where I can take breaks where I need to, and I can accommodate a health condition within my own life. There's also racial and cultural diversity. They have very different perspectives than us with the problems that you're trying to solve. But you can also get wrapped around the axle with the technology. We think about some of the common heart rate monitors and the methodologies there. A lot of them have difficulty with things like tattoos and darker skin tones. You know, if we get broader with how we investigate our user base and how we're doing testing, how we're, trying to find the potential breaking points in our projects, and how we find those failure points early, it allows us to anticipate and adjust the technology to really fit into the lives of these users. And as a final point in this area, age is really a factor these days. It's a big focus of what we're seeing from the FDA, and how age-related comorbidities and age-related health issues are impacting their performance in discrete areas of how they're caring for themselves. Technology adoption is also, an interesting area to examine here, where, the old adage was that people who were in the elderly population weren't using smartphones. That's not really the case anymore. There's a lot of adoption in there. The really finer point is, seeing trends around app use versus mobile web. There's some very different aspects to the way user interfaces happen there, anticipating how they may be porting over and understanding from one to the other, as we start to leverage some of these things in the home to help us to deliver healthcare. So we've learned about, we've investigated how they're going to be living and how they're going to maybe bring this device into their world. How do we act on that? We really pressed hard, and we've done the research right. We've invested in trying to do generative research to really learn about them. If improving healthcare outcomes is the goal, we all believe in that. We're doing this for the right reason. Device adoption is really how we're going to get there. We need to we're going into someone's home, and the device, it really has to mesh with how their life already works in order to have an impact. For patients, it's really about behavior change. How's your device going to support them? They had a life before we came into their world and before their life was disrupted by their healthcare condition. It's been impacted. How are we trying to help them get back to a new normal? What are we doing to support that? Does your device require a ton of care and feeding? If you think about apps or other things in the consumer electronics area of the world that you brought into your life, how often have you rejected a piece of software because it just became noisy and obnoxious? It's the same thing with how we're trying to integrate with their life in order to make them successful caring for themselves. It's the rational thought of they have to do this, they're going to engage, isn't always the case. So how we are able to do things like automate and automate and automate again to make sure that we're not asking too much of the user. We're collecting data from connected sensors and passive sources. We're leveraging technology that already exists in their lifestyle to accelerate workflows and reduce the number of inputs that we want. So when you do ask them to engage, it's maybe 2 or 3 touch points, and then you're back out of their way to make them successful in caring for themselves. You're in, you're out, and you're returning them to life. A good example of this, when you ask something from your users, do it at a time when they can act on it. Show up with the right answer and when they can take action. There was a drug delivery reminder app that exists, and it was for a once-weekly drug, and it was their first injectable drug. How do you help somebody like that be compliant? It's their first injectable. They're not used to taking injections. It's a once a week, so it's not really frequent. How do we adjust the product to be able to fit into their lives and make them successful? Well, reminders help, but if you fire me a reminder and I'm not at my house, I've gone out earlier in the morning than I usually do, and I don't have my drugs with me, I can't take action. I may snooze it, I may forget it, but it's not really helping me and it's not meeting me where I am at. So one way of adjusting that is location awareness. Wait until they're where they've told you their drug is and then fire the reminder. Adjustments like that help a ton. Instructions for use. Just giving them information on a piece of paper really doesn't help. if you're asking them simple questions through their interface, did you take your medication? Were you consistent? Did you take it on time? Did you take it late? If I took it late, have you taken it yet? If you get beyond the window of time where you're supposed to take it, well, actually wait until the following week. You can give instruction in bite-sized amounts that actually tell them the next action to take so that you're reducing the cognitive burden so they're going to be successful. It makes it easier for them to adopt. And it really is the keystone to how you get them to change their behavior and adopt your product. And as you support them, set them up for mastery, and then really just try and get out of the way. For clinician, you know, we kind of get this, and Adam touched a lot on this before, and it's a very rich area. You know, as clinicians, how are we supporting them? Raw data doesn't help. They're squeezed for time. They really got into this to maintain relationships with their patients, and they want to focus on the delivery of medication. If we flood them with data, it's low risk for us as developers, but that lowering of the potential barrier to market places a burden on your users, and they're actively rejecting it. All the recent studies that I've done, every single HCP has said, I don't want raw data. What I would prefer are synthesized insights with rationales that help us to understand, do we agree or disagree with it? It's a higher barrier for market to meet regulator expectations if you do that, but it's really what the end users are looking for. They're looking for superpowers. They're not looking for, you know, bulk data that they can sort through as a new career in data science. It also focuses in on, you know, performance. If we're asking them to sort through all this, there's a lot of burden that they have to do about cognitive burden about making decisions about how is this data that we're seeing here relevant to the decision they're making or not, and I have to sort through all this. There's still people. If we're putting that burden on them as the end user of that data, they're fallible, and it may impact their judgment, and it may lower their performance over time. So key here is to support them by giving them insights. So how are we integrating into their workflows? As we think about this, integrating their current tool set is pretty crucial. Most of us know that. They're not going to change their enterprise systems. Asking them to carry around an extra piece of hardware is a really guaranteed way to get them to say, no, I don't like you. Please don't give that to me. Thank you very much. Consider how it's fitting into their service model, because it's really driven by their healthcare system. And adoption is tough if we don't allow the device to be able to fit into something that they can charge back for, because they're answerable for their time to the health system that they work through. So we have to make sure that we're supporting them so they can engage with this new device and really support their patients. So let's bring it back to the patient for a little bit. When we talk about this, what can we learn from consumer products? We're going into their homes, often we're even going into their pockets. What can we learn from them? What do we need to leave behind? Because medical really isn't a lifestyle brand. In a lot of cases, consumer products are measuring success by how much they're getting stickiness, how much they're holding onto your attention, the Instagrams, the Facebooks of the world. How much time are you engaging? And I've seen clients try and port that over, and it doesn't work as well. There's sort of a dichotomy there. You know, we do want to have our patients engaged in their healthcare, but asking them to live in that experience is telling them that they have to live in their health condition, and that becomes the center of their identity. That actually degrades their emotional reserves and lessens their willpower to stay with integrating this new therapy into their lives. It really is a performance degrader in my experience. They don't want their illness to be their new normal. They want to be humans with relationships and being a father, a husband, somebody who relates to the community. If you think of your device, one good model that I found is that if you think of it like a CPA, your users are going to value this experience. It comes around to tax time. They want to go in, they want to unload their burdens into the CPA. CPA sorts it out, makes it very neat, makes it very actionable, hands it back to you as a very organized set of information. You then can file it, you can take care of yourself and move on. But they don't want to live in their taxes. It's the same with their healthcare. If you're treating them like a human and you're really reinforcing how you're getting them back to a normal life, you're going to be more successful at how they're engaging, and just have those momentary touch points where you're checking them, getting them back on track, and then getting out of the way. So conversely though, have you raised your game to meet the expectations of this new space that you're living in? If we're going into the pocket, are you being a good guest? Or are you trying to take over? A good image to have in your head is, how intrusive would it be to have a hospital bed inserted into the middle of your home? It would take over, it would become the presence of the household, and it shifts the dynamic that goes on in that home space. So if you're going to be going into their home or into their pocket, have you raised the design experience level of your product so it can survive comparisons to Apple, Samsung, Amazon, Fitbit? Your users have really learned about connected experiences from companies like this. Your device is going to be perceived as being taken a step backwards if it's not rising to that level. It's a point of potential dissatisfaction. It's also a point of rejection. And if they have learnings that they took from those companies, they bring it over to your product, is it going to be consistent? Because that's also a source of use errors, which could either delay your product's filing or could be a post-market surveillance finding later on. Connected experiences also create weird misunderstandings. I've done a lot of work in connected health apps, and especially around drug delivery. I'm surprised at how often really intelligent patients are looking at notifications and seeing that as a message directly from the clinician, almost like a text message. Those kind of misunderstandings may not matter depending on what the content is. It also could be that you're expecting them to utilize good judgment about whether or not it's time to take an action or not take an action. And they may not see it that same way. Their mental model may be that my doctor just told me to take an injection of insulin, I'm going to go do that, and suddenly they could be in a bad way. Watch those misunderstandings and really lean into trying to understand how they view your technology, because sometimes the sophistication you expect isn't necessarily there. Challenging ourselves to simplify, as Adam said, and only ask what we need to of our users to get to the bare minimum to help them succeed, and then again, just get out of their way. So we've done a great design, we've done our great generative research. How do we bring it home? We really want to meet the FDA's expectations for human factors engineering, but many of my clients will tell us that it can seem daunting or unpredictable, and we really do believe that there's a couple key touch points that will help you to succeed. It really needs to be a collaborative effort to succeed, both within your team and also with the agency. We all know what the agency expects out of the basics for human factors engineering. We need good user profiles. We need good user environments. We need to understand the task. We also need to understand the use-related risks. It's critical to good use-related risk management. Alternatively, though, getting in early and having a well-articulated usability engineering strategy for your product at the start helps you to get focus within your project and make sure your team is addressing the things that are important and critical, both from a business standpoint as well as from a use-related risk standpoint. It also unlocks this magic moment, and I really do believe in the power of this, which is a pre-sub. If you communicate transparently what your strategy is for your validation of your product against the use-related risks, how you view them, how you're defining your users, and laying everything out on the table, it's a powerful moment because the FDA has such a broad view and they see so many more inputs than we possibly can as individual device developers. We can get deep within our own work and they can't match that, but we can't match their breadth. Getting their insights and having them feed it to us gives us such a tremendous superpower with the predictability that we all desire for how we're going to address going through the development of a product and make sure that we're actively managing against the regulator's expectations. There are some clients who really are uncomfortable treating it that way, and my biggest advice is to really engage with that. It's been amazing when we've done it. It's also really important when you do that, though, to engage with a team member who understands the human factors engineering process. They don't have to be a human factors engineer specifically, but they really need to understand the process and how validation works. Because as you're feeding information in through your lead contact into the agency, we've seen some variety of responses that, we would like to have go the planned route rather than the unplanned route. Let's call it that. We've had successful submissions with, a large validation pool, we felt, which was 45 participants, but we described them adequately to say we could slice and dice a matrix of this pool of 45 users to cover all the variables that we needed to address, and aggressively identified where the use-related risks were in the program. And we've had the FDA say, that sounds like a great plan. It's really based in the science of human factors engineering, and we appreciate your due diligence. I've also seen programs where, in going in, the lead representative to the FDA had more background in clinical studies, and the numbers there are so much larger that, going with a 100-person validation study didn't seem as daunting. And some of the differences between those user groups were really subtle. And so, backing that up with more rationale and science and really debating that with the FDA, make sure that you're not missing anything if you have to go that route, and that you really understand the rationale for why they were doing it. Also making sure that you're presenting the information well, so that you're really going after the numbers you need to manage the risk appropriately without overblowing the budget or the effort required to do so. It's a real balance, and we really want to do the right thing ethically, but you can get in the wrong way by miscommunicating. And I'm going to hand back to Adam at this point.
Alex, can I interject for a moment? I just was
Absolutely
curious. One of the things that I've been thinking about as you've been talking is there a gold standard here in terms of a technology from a patient's point of view, and then from a clinician, physician point of view, thinking like, something that's really helpful? Is there a product that is there sort of an iPod, iPhone type product out there that is kind of the gold standard that you think has met all those? And what would that be from the clinician's point of view? And what would that be from the patient's point of view, if you had any examples there?
That's an interesting one. I don't think we've seen the killer connected technology yet. I think there were some interesting ones a few years back that were pretty advanced. They had a connected BG meter, for example, that went into the bottom of the iPhone, and it was reducing the amount of materials that a user had to carry with them, and was starting to acknowledge that, you can leverage technology in the pocket, you can take it on. I think there's a lot of efforts that are on the very edge of breaking in terms of getting that out there. And I do see the smartphone itself as a technology that is underutilized and under leveraged, specifically because everything's still segmented within it. If you think about a user's view of how they are managing their health, they're managing their health. They're not managing their diabetes health. They're not managing their irritable bowel syndrome health. They're not managing each of those distinct areas. They want to look at it globally, but there isn't a single platform yet that helps them to do that. From the clinician standpoint, I can speak to a technology that seems to be doing pretty well, which is Smart on Fire, for its ability to integrate into their EMR, EHR workflow, and to allow device manufacturers to pop into that platform that already exists and is a major technology to unseat or disrupt within their workspace. And I've seen some traction around that's been helpful. Does that answer your question well enough?
Yeah. I was just curious, I guess, when I think of first of all, talking about just a tremendous variety of technologies, everything from like the home hemodialysis machine to, I guess you could say even a Fitbit is kind of
it's health and wellness.
Yeah. So each of those, each of those have their own sort of stickiness, but I was just wondering if there was a technology sort of that we're all kind of chasing in some respects, just adoption curve wise. But I think you answered that. Adam, I think you're on mute there.
Great, thank you. You're seeing my screen now?
Yes.
So we'll turn now to, in a home connected device, what does that look like? What are some choices you have to make? You know, we'll talk about some of the pros and cons of different things that go into decisions, and they cover 4 different areas. There's the user interface platform. There's choices there. There's choices in how do you connect a device in the home. How do you set up the whole server and enterprise system to accommodate all that? So that's we'll have a few slides on that now. One thing to recognize is that unlike most medical devices, where, you know, for those in the medical device field, we know that the typical and classical way to create a medical device is you specify it, you design it, you verify that it meets your requirements, you validate that it meets the user needs, you go out there, you manufacture it, you get procedures, you lock it down, the FDA says, great, we accept those results, don't change anything. And that is just not the world in a connected environment. There are many things that change, and the FDA is recognizing this. But, you know, as a medical device manufacturer, you now have to change almost your whole culture because you are managing this dynamic environment. So how are you going to manage all this change? For a big example is cybersecurity. If you're connected, you by definition have a cybersecurity issue, and the FDA has guidance about what that means and what you have to do. And that includes monitoring cybersecurity threats that are relevant and taking action about them, having an active program. It's almost like post-market monitoring, but in a connected way. And once you do that, now all of a sudden you've got a software question. You know, how do you manage software updates when you have a distributed device base? And it's not like you can send a technician out to the radiology machine and he plugs in his USB or something. There has to be a software upgrade, and that's another infrastructure that needs to be built. The big one, and you know, is always that cell phone, tablets, and PCs are very dynamic. You know, you buy one now, and in 6 months it won't be the same. The operating systems change. So you're signing up to being in a world where you're doing a lot of upkeep just to keep up with the rate of change in that world. Wireless infrastructure change. You know, there's the generations of wireless infrastructure do come in and out. And if you've built a cell phone into your device in some number of years, you might have bought an inexpensive one because you didn't need a lot of bandwidth, and now all of a sudden, you know, it's no longer supported. And one that most people don't think about is open source software. If you're going to run a Linux device, for example, because or any other, you know, the open source software, that software you know, has both licensing issues and also control management. So you might download all these great tools that are all available, but there might be 700 licenses and 700 different, you know, little pieces that you never realize that there's a font manager inside of it, or you know, or a communications port or a printer thing that is there's some license in it. So this is a non-trivial issue to have these controlled that's constantly changing. There are tools to do it, and they're typically pretty expensive, and you gotta manage it. So what does a home connectivity system look like? You know, basically it's a device. Somehow you connect to a server, and you have a user that's involved with this whole thing. This is an example of how you do it. And we'll talk about some of the choices and the pros and the cons of some of these choices. You know, so this is sort of a simplified version of just who's doing what. The first question is, what's your connectivity mechanism? You know, I always like to say that the best connectivity mechanism is all of them, because I don't know about where you live, but my cell phone can be spotty. If I'm downstairs, it might not work. From upstairs, it does. Lots of people live in rural environments. So lots of people live in big buildings that don't have cell phone connectivity. So that's a question. And then there's Wi-Fi. Well, some people have Wi-Fi, and there's of course the ubiquitous, you know, cell phone, which then you have to get to, and typically you go to that with Bluetooth or Bluetooth Low Energy. That's a wireless way that's all built in, and those are all different ways to get to the server. But the reality is that they're not always going to be connected. You know, cell phones don't work, Wi-Fi doesn't, you know, goes down, and sometimes they're just away from all that, and so they might want to use their device. And it's an important question about how do you deal with not always being connected. The last thing you want to do is require a connection so that you have a failure to serve the functionality of the medical product. Let's say you have a, you know, I mean, and there's some, it's very different depending on what you're doing. If you're doing a fall alarm, for example, you have to be connected. The whole point of it is to send an alarm when somebody falls. Otherwise, there's no point. But if you're trying to read somebody's some kind of a test or a blood pressure or measurement, you know, maybe you can not be connected, and then when you do connect, you know, you can get all that data uploaded. It's like, for example, a Holter monitor. You know, they're not connected all the time, and then you go and you'll download that data later when you need it. So that really changes the way you think about a device, because the connectivity needs necessarily to be intermittent. And then there's all this trade-off between the cost and the complexity of your device. You might want to make it, because it's a home device, it typically has to be less expensive. And does it make sense to build a cell phone into it? Does it make sense to build a Wi-Fi connection into it? You know, Bluetooth is very inexpensive. So the beautiful thing about using a cell phone is that it gives you all that. It comes with all that power that you can harness. But there's downsides to that. And that points to the next question of you know, what's your user interface platform? You can have really no user interface, or I should say a very simple one. You might just have a button that pushes something, or you might have none. You might have a scale, and you walk on the scale, and it uploads the data. So you might, you know, and basically you don't have to do anything other than setting it up. But setting it up isn't always so easy, especially when you have a very diverse population. They're not always tech savvy. And how do you deal with that? Again, making it simpler, but also there's a balance between, for example, the ability to have something be easy to set up and have cybersecurity, because, like, for example, Bluetooth is known. It's getting more secure, but it's been known to require multiple steps to make it more secure, which makes it harder to use. An interesting fun fact is that, you know, most people do have cell phones these days. You know, there's a 90% acceptance rate, even in the population of 65 and above. That which is a major target for medical. You know, they use a lot of medical devices, and they're prime candidates for home usage. But it just so turns out that only 50% of them are smartphones. So a lot of them have older versions or non-smartphone versions. And I know that many of us wouldn't consider that, but they can just be a regular, you know, a telephone that doesn't have smartphones when you're not running apps on it. So it's not a ubiquitous thing, even though cell phone service is mostly ubiquitous. The actual ability to run a smartphone or even have one in that population is only 50%. So you have to make a decision about, are you going to use the cell phone? You can use the device. You can have a display and buttons and a normal interface to the device, and simply not use the cell phone and have a cell phone built into it, or a Wi-Fi connection. You know, so that's a decision that has to be made, and there's non-trivial trade-offs between those, both in terms of cost and complexity. Remember that you can have multiple home devices. You might have, you know, the joke is that everybody wants to be the core the core platform in the home. Everybody wants to own that space. Well, that means that now you've got a scale and a heart monitor and an insulin thing and all these different devices that are moving into the home. There can be quite a lot of them, and that can add complexity both in terms of just the difficulty of the mobile apps and all that connectivity and keeping it all working. I'm lucky enough to live in a nice house that has lots of systems in it, and they break all the time. And I frankly just a lot of time just turn it off because I don't want to be keeping things going all the time. If I have 5 or 6 systems and one, every now and then have to maintain it, some people are just going to turn them off. So then what does it look like in a bigger context in terms of a medical device and architecture for a connected medical device? The orange box is Sunrise's definition of what we call all the functionality you need to control, interface to the device. And I think of that as kind of the medical device subsystem. And it's nice because we've kind of tried to make a clean architecture that it's gives you all the things you need to have that connected devices, but allows you to do other things outside of the device as well. So if you'll have that device, up here you'll see you'll have an engineering interface which you need to build it in because when you're developing, you have to have a way to do the development. You have to have a way to get up to the cloud and typically there'll be on like maybe a mobile app. And then there's a server which can be on the cloud. It can be in your own server, and you typically have a database which may or may not be HIPAA compliant. And then there's all the administrative functions that you would want to do with that fleet of devices. Now you have to really think of it as a fleet of medical devices. So there's both the database and the infrastructure administration, which like let's say you're on AWS or some other cloud platform. A lot of that comes along with it, and you have to put the things that you need specifically like a HIPAA compliant database. You'd have to have fleet management tools, ways to get in and out of that database. And if you look on the outside of the orange box, you'll see all kinds of uses for that data and things that you might want to do as well. Like for example, a business enterprise system. I'm sure you have a billing system. You might want to control usage of that data. You might want to pull data off for machine learning purposes or just tracking purposes or business purposes. You might send data off to an EHR, and you might have just web interfaces. Very very often people want to have web interfaces to that data. Like a clinician might download all their patients and they can monitor a dashboard or something. And those are all things that the medical device management system can interface to, and you can architect in different ways. Not everybody's going to want an online e-commerce service, but some people will, and they'll have different. So this is kind of the way we think of how you architect, to support both the business, the users, and the clinicians, customers, and all the internal things that you'd want to do as a business. So if you look at the, what are other things that you'll do in that server cloud architecture? There's typically user authentication. You want to make sure that the people are who they say they are, and with passwords and things like that. That's a classic thing that you put in. Fleet management and monitoring. You want to know if you're online. You want to know who's using what. So then you can get reports and do all kinds of improvements to your system. And just the whole data management, typical database management for your HIPAA compliant database. Service and diagnostics is kind of medical device oriented. Software upgrades is also medical device, and then you'd want to be able to generate reports and send them out, have a standard interface to the others, EHR and business enterprise systems. The database is interesting because actually very often people don't, they structure their code, their system in a way that they don't need to be HIPAA compliant. And you really have to ask yourself hard, do you really need to know, to know who these people are, or do you just want randomized data for, say, machine learning? You don't need to know who they are for research purposes. If you are HIPAA compliant, then the whole system, there's ways to do this that we've worked out that are basically, everything has to be encrypted, both when it's stationary and also when you move data. It can't be unencrypted anywhere, really. And there's tools to do that. And thank you. Why does that surprise me?
That's great. So we're going to start answering a few questions we have here. Here's a question from the chat room. How do we keep validation true to indication for use when home user cases are not exhaustively thought through? Physician compliance versus user freedom challenge, I guess, to use in your presentation parlance.
So that's one I feel comfortable taking on, and if you're okay with that, Adam.
Yeah.
I think that's one of the ones where you have to roll up your sleeves early and rely on your human factors engineers or user-centered designers getting involved early and starting to flush out those use cases. It is tougher because it is less controlled space, and there are times where you're going to rely on the design controls you can put inside your device to prevent certain actions. And then there's other areas where you have to accept the flexibility because in order to deliver the right kind of therapy. And that balance between exerting control to help your user not get into harm, right, and enough flexibility to make the therapy effective, that's core. And then making sure that you're doing the analysis work up front and thinking about your product deeply enough as a core technology, as a platform, and how people currently relate to those things is going to be key to being successful there.
Great. So I'm taking questions. You can put them in the chat box, or if you want, you can click on participants at the bottom and it gives you a chance to raise your hand. Well, here's a question on FDA pre-submission. Does it need to have some feasibility data already, or should we first do a request for study risk determination?
I'm going to address that from specifically a human factors engineering validation work. It doesn't hurt to have performance data from simulated use studies. It definitely helps for people to understand how you've come to the conclusions that you do and take them more seriously if you have some recent data from having interacted with users. That said, there have been times in programs where, from a strategy standpoint, we had to get in early based on the length of timeline that we were expecting and the kind of response times, and sometimes it's 3 months, sometimes it's 6 months to hear back from the FDA about, getting a pre-submission time in with them. So you have to factor all of these variables in and book accordingly. And so I prefer to have as much data and much analysis work as we can to feed that and have the full human factors engineering validation plan generated and send that in as, here's the document that we intend to go off of for our validation plan, and here's how we've managed the risks. You could even send in, part of your USERRA FMEA and get as much data on the table so that they can tell you, yeah, we've seen things like this before, but you've missed this big chunk over here. Or actually, this is really interesting that you went aggressively in this direction. We really support what you're doing because it's novel and you're really thinking about this deeply enough.
Great, and I know that there's going to be a whole host of questions about regulatory and reimbursement, and I think probably if there is demand for that, we will go ahead and probably do a second in this series on it, because clearly that's sort of one of the major elephants in the room. Just curious, you said something about pets, and I was sort of what are some of the more unexpected things that you guys have seen with what people do with high tech gadgets? And let's keep this. I mean, I know it's after 5 o'clock, but we'll keep this work safe here. But what and how do you even like begin to plan for that? I mean, like that's kind of a.
Oh gosh, there's such a variety. Adam, do you have any particular ones?
Yeah, it's interesting because probably my favorite home healthcare device is actually an artificial heart that we worked on. It's a take home total artificial heart. So it's not a casual device. And there were some strange things like fur and hot temperatures and water leaking in, and they had an example where you talked about a cat. They also had a cat
that's ubiquitous.
They like the heat, so they sit on top of things, and this is the person's heart. They wake up and the cat is on top of their artificial heart pump.
Yeah, or the artificial kidney, as the case may be. The cat was a particular favorite one, and I think there was something in the dialysate mix that the cat appreciated the flavor for. And this wasn't a singular cat. This was a number of events that were observed. The warmth was fun. The cat was attracted to that. The sort of like this almighty voice from on high coming into your world and advising you what to do, that was always a surprising one. Like, okay, normally you wouldn't walk into traffic if I told you to, but suddenly this phone tells you to, and it's from a trusted source, and suddenly it takes on a different life. And we all laugh, but it's the same thing as people following their GPS into a lake. It happens. Yeah. And people don't admit to it as much because it's fairly embarrassing, but I've watched it directly in simulated use studies, and it's sort of this tone of voice thing, and it's this voice of authority, and you can get into interesting situations from it.
Yeah, death by GPS, right? That's
absolutely
a classic one. And cats also love Zoom meetings, so maybe they're actually they might be kind of a perfect test case scenario there. Awesome.
I just want to throw with the heart pump part. They worry about people like dropping it in the bathtub and in the toilet, stuff like that.
How do you keep users engaged with their device instead of them just like me with? I mean, I used my that pulse oximeter a couple times just for fun, but quite quickly I kind of realized it just kind of ended up in my drawer. Any tips for how you can kind of keep users engaged? I'll
share one out before I give this to you, because we've done a number of things. People do involve gamification, especially when they're younger users. We did one that was a device for younger users, and it basically became gamified, and they kids responded to that. But there's other kinds of gamification. Adults respond to it too. They do all kinds of on social media. So there's that is something that people use, and it tends to be effective to a point. It's kind of like, I don't know, these video games. People eventually sort of lose interest in them just as well. But those things that we saw were that there was a moderate length extended engagement from it.
And to follow on top of that, it's in my mind it's sort of a combination of events, because there is a large part of this that's between the ears. There's a moment of readiness, and there's a need that's got to be there. So in the heart rate monitor, that need probably wasn't there. There wasn't something that would drive a reason for that product to exist in a regular basis in your world. I'm assuming. Beyond that, it's managing the level of demands that you're making on your users, so that when you do come into the world and ask for attention, it's thoughtful, it's relevant, and it's actionable. And if we think about diet apps are a really big one. So Under Armour has a pretty good one. Nike's got some great fitness apps. What tends to happen though is that they're constantly firing reminders that are time-based, and it becomes noisy and it becomes interfering. And you're intruding at points like, okay, dinner's finished and now I need to move on. It's been a real struggle for that area of the industry to get engagement unless you already are really motivated and it's just an element in there. Low motivation and how you're managing that level of demand on the inpatient, I think is really there. And then having an expected exit strategy where you're just in maintenance mode with your end users. You've gotten them to the point of mastery, and then they don't need to really focus on you as much, except when you're just coming in at the right times to help them be successful.
Right, and I think also helping them understand what they're seeing is important, right? I mean,
yeah,
contextualizing the data that they're collecting. I think of it almost as analogous to like, most people, don't need daily access to their retirement accounts, but once you give them access to it, they tend to check the balance all the time, right? So,
absolutely.
It actually brings up a point about engagement, and I think Alex was spot on when he said, that the engagement is at the level that's necessary, and that's true with the physician users as well. And I'll bring up there was a system that was essentially like a remote Holter monitor, and where you would give it to somebody and they would, and the way those systems work is that it gathers a lot of data, it uploads it, and then there's essentially a control center which is taking that data, processing it, and generating the data in a report form that's digestible by the physician. The physician doesn't really want to look at it all the time. He doesn't want to search through all that data. So part of the ways that you keep people engaged is by keeping the things you're giving them to be what they want, and for the physician, just like a lab test. They get a lab test and it says red or green, and they scan it and they say, oh, you've got a problem. Your blood pressure is too high, and let's give you a blood pressure medication. They don't want to have, they want as quickly as possible to assimilate that. So part of the goal is to really give them what is useful and helpful to them, both the users and the clinicians, in a way that's pre-digested.
Yeah. It sounds like there's just such thing as too much engagement. Sometimes maybe being a bad thing, right? I mean, like self-diagnosing yourself with a heart attack because you have an elevated heart rate or something like that, right? I mean, there's definitely a risk.
Yeah, when WebMD came online, there was a lot of grasping for symptoms and chasing like, oh, it's all cancer, and there's been a ton of memes out there about that, but there is some truth there to the psychology. One last little point here that I want to make is sort of the virtuous loop that you can insert into here too with the medical device, where the feedback that users are getting isn't just through the user interface. If you are helping them to feel better, both quantitatively and qualitatively, that measurement and that kind of success starts to drive a feedback loop into the level of engagement. I've invested, you've given me results. I've invested, you've given me results. And as you continue to pay off along that curve, while also planning for a natural trail out of the amount of time needing to be invested to retain that mastery, you'll see good levels of engagement across your product going forward. And I think appropriate, as we've kind of touched on already, engagement.
Yeah, I've been guilty of the WebMD thing, and my doctor has not enjoyed my self-diagnosis. Rachel, do we have any other questions that you see?
I think you've covered it. I think those were some great questions and a really awesome discussion. Unless anyone has any other things to chime in on the chat bot, I think that's everything.
Well, excellent. Well, this has been a really engaging, exciting discussion. We will do more of these. I think we definitely can look into some of the reimbursement and regulatory side, because that is obviously a major factor involved in all this. And so we will continue on that. But I want to thank Adam and Alex and the team at Sunrise Labs for doing a terrific job, both setting the table here and executing on it. And I want to thank all of you for joining us today. You guys were a great audience, and again, MassMEDIC, you can keep in touch with us on massmedic.com, and you'll keep in touch with all the things we have going on. We have plenty of webinars and online educations. We have a weekly town hall. We'd love you to attend, and thank you again, and we'll see you again very soon.
Have a great night, everyone.
Thanks for hosting us.
My pleasure. Thank you.
Thanks, Brian.
Thanks,
Thank you, guys. Great job. Talk soon.
Yep. Bye-bye, Brian.
Bye-bye.
Thank you.